So this week we take the Civil War head on, which of course is a really important part of the 19th century. And I wanted to start by giving you a really quick primer of the Civil War. Basically, this section is going to take care of the lead up to the Civil War, and then the next section will address the Civil War itself. So a question that I want you to think about this week is whether the Civil War is an example of a failing union or the search for a more perfect union, which is one of our running themes. So there's a couple of things that I want you to think about and know as you begin to look at the things in the modules for this week. First of all, in 1820, there was a law that was passed, which is known as the Missouri Compromise, which allowed for the state of Missouri to come in as a slave state. At the time, it was a territory, and the territory of Maine to come in as free. That particular law was a compromise, one of many, which actually began in 1789 with the Northwest Ordinance, but it is going to be crucial for the way in which northern and southern states think about the issue of slavery. Another law that will come later, which is the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, will also bring about significant dissatisfaction in terms of the way that Northerners and Southerners are thinking about the issue of slavery. So this particular map basically begins to show you familiar information, hopefully. And as you can see, free states and territories are those that are depicted in blue. Slave states are those that are depicted in brown. But these particular territories, which had been opened as a direct result of the Mexican-American War, which you approached before looking at this, basically opened a can of worms in the way in which Americans thought about the issue of slavery. So one of the things that happens is that this idea of popular sovereignty allows for people and for those with particular interests in whether these territories became slave or free to finance people moving to those territories so that they would ultimately be able to vote them in as either a slave state or a free state. So this issue of popular sovereignty, while attractive, is going to create significant problems for the Union. In addition to that, I wanted to show you some of the significant discrepancies in terms of population distributions relative to enslaved people. And as you can see, there were some significant differences. I also want you to notice that there were some populations of free Black people. And that is important to note because the experience of all Black people was not that of slavery. Although it was a tenuous freedom, it was freedom. And so it's important to keep that in mind as you think about the issues we're covering this week. In addition to that, I wanted to show you the area that we traditionally call the Cotton Belt. As you can see, cotton production extended from Texas all the way through the Carolinas. There were a couple of other crops which will be familiar to you, such as tobacco and corn, but rice, which had been a crop really since the inception of, for example, the Carolina colonies in the 17th century, as well as sugar, were also part of production during this period. And wherever you see significant population, especially significant production, especially in the context of cotton, you actually will find that there are significant numbers of enslaved people there. And of course, thinking about the previous slide, you can definitely see how that works. One of the things that enslavers were very afraid of was rebellion. That was a constant fear. We see it both in their correspondence as well as newspaper accounts of rebellions that are happening in other places in North America. And here you actually have a depiction of Nat Turner's Rebellion, and there's a whole section in the module for this week on that, as well as a video that's part of a graphic novel style representation of the massacre itself. I also included what is known as his confession, which was actually taken up by someone else. He didn't write it himself. So keep that in mind if you when you decide to take a look at it. But ultimately, these rebellions were a way for enslaved people to express their dissatisfaction. As I mentioned in the module, not all rebellions were as extreme as Nat Turner's, but I do want you to keep in mind that rebellions were a constant, not only in the United States, but really in the Caribbean and the rest of the Americas. In addition to that, something else to keep in mind is that there were smaller rebellions that didn't necessarily result in massacres, but ultimately this was something that was enough of a constant that enslavers were very much afraid and reacted to these particular events. Lastly, I wanted to address the issue of freedom papers. As you noticed from the previous slide, there were some free enslaved people. And as a direct result of that, we actually find that freedom often dependent on pieces of paper that basically stated that people were free. And unfortunately, because that type of freedom is very tenuous, it was expected that if you were an individual who was Black in the South, that you were in fact enslaved. And so oftentimes papers would be torn, they would be disposed of, or in some extreme cases, people who were free were actually abducted. And the story of Solomon Northup, who you may have heard of before, there is a movie known as 12 Years a Slave, and actually that is the name of his own account of being abducted from the North and taken to the South and enslaved and ultimately gaining his freedom, was unfortunately something that was taking place. Part of the reason that this was the case was because in the first decade of the 19th century, the United States actually prohibits the transatlantic slavery. So the movement and selling of enslaved people will primarily be done from southern states along the coasts of the Atlantic, and then the slave trade will basically move westward, which also follows many of the patterns that we have seen before. So Solomon Northup is somebody who's going to humanize this precariousness of freedom. And for those of you who are interested, there's the movie itself, and you can find this trailer on YouTube. In addition to that, you can think about somebody like Harriet Tubman, who was in direct defiance of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And of course, she was part of that Underground Railroad. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that Harriet Tubman, who had been enslaved herself, has her own story. And I just wanted to call your attention and remind you that there is a movie called Harriet, which actually depicts her life story. So keep those things in mind as you read the secession papers, because they do tell us a lot about what was taking place at the time. And then lastly, one of the things that I want to leave you with is a way that historians organize the issue of slavery in terms of both timeline as well as importance in society. And one of them is that the South was a slave society. So there's two ways to think about the question of slavery in different places during the 19th century. One of them is to think of societies as a society with slaves. That is, that slavery existed within those societies, but it is not as rigidly prescribed. So for example, people could become free. There was not an assumption that if you were Black or indigenous, that you were an enslaved person. And so there is some freedom in that type of society that does not exist in a slave society. And so historians, when discussing a slave society, discuss a society that is enmeshed in slavery. That is, all social norms, customs, and laws are basically dictated by the way in which slavery exists in a particular society. So keep that in mind. If you have any questions about it, let me know.